So I was recently offered shares in a startup to become an early employee in that particular startup. And I went through a whole process of negotiating and talking to the company and also asking lots of important questions, particularly around the startup itself, the phase it was at, and the shares I was being offered. And as part of that process, I actually passed on the opportunity. The company was at a reasonable stage of funding. They were actually past their Series A. They were about to raise a Series B, or actually about to close a Series B round. And I wanted to walk you through the actual structure of the shares I was being offered, or the questions I asked to understand the structure of the shares I was offered in order to pass on that opportunity. So if you are ever in a position to be approached by a startup to become an early employee in that startup, I would recommend asking some combination or all of these questions so that you understand if they're going to be really valuable or not in the first place. So the first thing I asked was how much money had that startup raised to the date. And so the common conception would be that the more money that you've raised is a good thing, and that's not always necessarily a great thing. As a matter of fact, the more money they've raised, the less equity they may have available to give out to people. So think of it this way: if they've raised a whole bunch of money, they've typically already had to give up shares in the company to investors and other folks, and this can feed into other issues. So the first question I asked was how much money they've raised in the first place. Then I asked how many shares are outstanding. So let me walk you through how this works. So when a company is created or founded, they name the number of shares that are available. So let's use it as an example. 1,000,000 shares are available. When let's say there's two founders. There's two founders that are going to start this business together. They may each issue 300,000 shares to themselves. So if you're early in the business, it's just the two founders. They had 1,000,000 available shares. They've issued 300,000 shares to each other. That's 600,000. That means that there would be 600,000 shares of the 1,000,000 possible that are outstanding. If they raise another round of funding, and let's say they give the investor 200,000 shares of the company, that means there are now 800,000 shares outstanding of the possible 1,000,000. So 300,000 per founder plus the 200,000 they give the investor. And so anything that is not outstanding is a pool of available shares that they could issue. So in the example of the startup that I just did for you, with 1,000,000 available shares, but 800,000 outstanding. So again, 300,000 to each founder plus 200,000 to an investor. That would mean there are a total of 800,000 outstanding, but there are still 200,000 shares that are available to be issued. They have not been issued yet. And so we call this a pool of shares that they can use. And so the fewer shares outstanding, the less the startup can afford to give out to you and other key employees. So if you started asking questions about how many shares are outstanding and they had 100,000 available, I'm sorry, 1,000,000 available, and they say, well, we've issued 975,000 shares, that means there's only 25,000 shares left. That's limiting the pool that they can give you because they may still need to make other key hires along the way and use those shares to entice people. The next question I ask is how much revenue is currently being generated? Startups sell for a multiple of, the revenue that they are producing. And so when they raise, startups oftentimes have to raise multiple rounds of funding to get to a profitable state. We see this with science-based startups. So if you're developing the next latest and greatest, drug that is used to cure a disease or treat a disease, those usually take a really long time to reach viability of their solution. So they may not be generating revenue early on, but revenue generation will eventually lead to valuation of the company and therefore valuation of your shares. So if you're in a startup that you believe really should be generating revenue, you need to understand how much they are generating. So maybe you're being approached by a SaaS solution, a software as a service solution. If they've got a product out in the market, they need to be generating revenue, or that's a bad sign that the shares you're being offered just aren't going to be valued. And one more note on this: remember, revenue generation does not always equal profitability. If their expenses outweigh their revenue, then they're not profitable. That leads us to the next question: how much revenue has to be generated for the shares to be valued. So the most common thing that valuations are tied to, like I said, is revenue generation. This is particularly true with public markets when you're doing an IPO. If the company isn't generating enough revenue and particularly profitability, then the shares you are offered are what's called underwater, and they are absolutely worthless. So you should be asking how much revenue has to be generated for the shares to be valuable. You should do some of your own calculations along that way. I would then consider what are the market comps. Now, this is not necessarily something you ask the startup that is offering you the shares, but ask yourself, what are the market comps? So startups tend to be the valuation then follows some logical comparison. So if startup A and startup B are in the exact same industry, they have these very similar solutions, they have similar executive teams, similar stage of funding, all these different things, then they should be valued roughly within some degree of comparison of one another, pending other factors like revenue and stuff like that. So if startup A just completed an IPO and startup B has similar characteristics, you can use that as a comp to determine the valuation of the startup that you're considering joining. And how does that change things? Well, of course, the valuation drives the value of the shares you're being offered. So you as an employee can use market comps, public market comps, even of publicly traded companies, to determine the potential value of the startup you're considering joining, and therefore value the shares you're being offered. And then the last thing to understand is there what's called a preference stack. So early investors often get what's called preference when it comes to their investments. And this means essentially that they get paid off or paid out before anybody else does. So if the preference stack is so big that when the company sells, the value is eaten up and paid out to all the other investors first before the employees are paid out, then that means your shares may not be worth anything. And this happens in quite a few startups. So you need to understand what's the preference stack, what's the amount of the preference stack. Because if your venture that you're part of reaches $1 billion in value and sells for $1 billion, but the preference stack is going to eat up all $1 billion, then the key employees that were offered shares really aren't getting anything. So the key here is to ask these questions and use that to get some semblance of what the value of the shares is that you're being offered. I've talked to a lot of startups and what they will sometimes try and do, not all of them, but they will try and justify a bit lower in a salary in lieu of enticing people to join them with shares in the startup, because we've all heard stories of employee number 5 at Microsoft and what they're worth now. And certainly that does happen for folks. I believe folks like Chamath Palihapitiya, I believe he was part of the early stage of Facebook. And so that's where a lot of his personal net wealth comes from. And that can happen for you, but you need to understand that that does not happen to everybody. And it's a bit of a gamble whether or not the shares you're being offered are going to be worth something. So you should be asking these questions when you're offered a comp package about the shares that you're being offered. My best advice to you is don't decide if you're going to join the startup based on the shares that you're being offered and, thinking to myself, I'm going to be a billionaire one day when this thing goes big. Join the startup because you believe in its mission and because you're getting a competitive salary and that you enjoy the people you will be working with and the project excites you. Don't put too much weight into the shares in the startup, because it could be that they end up being worth nothing. Anyways, until next time, I hope that helps. Have a great day.